Trump's relationship with congressional Republicans has undergone a dramatic transformation in recent weeks. A growing number of lawmakers from his own party are now publicly characterizing the former president as a constitutional liability rather than a political asset, marking a fundamental shift in how the Republican establishment views his continued influence over party direction and policy priorities. And this is not simply another round of temporary tensions that will fade after the next election cycle, or a handful of moderate Republicans expressing private concerns that remain confined to off-the-record conversations. This represents a calculated reassessment by senior party leaders who have concluded that continued association with Trump's legal challenges and constitutional controversies creates more political risk than benefit for the party's long-term electoral prospects and institutional credibility. When Republican senators with impeccable conservative credentials begin using terms like constitutional liability in public statements and television interviews, the significance extends far beyond typical political disagreements over policy positions or electoral strategy. This language signals a determination that Trump's ongoing legal entanglements and challenges to establish constitutional norms have become impediments to the party's ability to attract moderate voters, maintain institutional legitimacy, and present a coherent governing agenda. The willingness of prominent Republicans to articulate these concerns publicly rather than limiting criticism to private conversations represents a threshold moment in party dynamics that merits careful attention and analysis. The sequence of events that produced this reassessment began accelerating in January when multiple legal proceedings reached critical junctures simultaneously. Federal courts rejected final appeals in document production cases that had been litigated for 18 months, requiring disclosure of financial records that Trump's legal team had fought to keep sealed. Congressional committees issued bipartisan subpoenas demanding testimony and documents related to potential conflicts of interest and abuse of power allegations. State prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions moved forward with criminal charges involving business fraud, election interference, and mishandling of classified documents. The cumulative effect of these simultaneous legal challenges created a situation where defending Trump required Republicans to take positions on constitutional questions that many found increasingly difficult to justify to constituents and legal scholars. The shift in Republican rhetoric became unmistakable during the first week of February when Senator Michael Harrison, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and a consistent Trump supporter through 2 impeachment proceedings, gave an extensive interview to a major news network. Harrison stated that while he continued to respect Trump's policy accomplishments during his presidency, the ongoing legal challenges and repeated conflicts with constitutional norms were creating serious problems for the party's message and credibility. He specifically noted that defending actions that federal courts had found to violate legal obligations or that involved defiance of congressional subpoenas required Republicans to adopt positions on executive power and institutional authority that contradicted long-standing conservative principles about limited government and constitutional constraints on executive action. Harrison's comments represented a significant departure from his previous public posture, and they immediately generated attention among political analysts who recognized that his willingness to express these concerns publicly indicated broader sentiment within the caucus. Within 48 hours, 3 additional Republican senators made similar statements in various forums. Senator Jennifer Matthews of Ohio, who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, told reporters that continued association with Trump's legal battles was making it extremely difficult for Republicans to maintain credibility on issues of law and order, respect for institutions, and constitutional governance. She emphasized that voters who valued stability and adherence to legal processes were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with a party that appeared to be defending actions that courts and prosecutors had identified as potentially criminal. Senator Robert Chen of Florida, a former federal prosecutor with deep expertise in constitutional law, provided even more pointed commentary during a speech at a legal conference in Washington. He argued that Republicans faced a fundamental choice between defending Trump's specific actions in ongoing legal proceedings or defending the broader constitutional principles that the party had historically championed. Chen stated that in his assessment, these two positions had become irreconcilable and that continuing to defend actions that violated legal obligations for the sake of political loyalty would ultimately prove more damaging to the party than acknowledging the problems and allowing legal processes to proceed without political interference. The public statements from these senior senators, all of whom had previously supported Trump and defended him against various allegations, signaled to other Republicans that expressing concerns about constitutional liabilities was no longer political suicide within the party. This created what political scientists describe as a cascade effect, where the initial willingness of prominent figures to articulate a position gives permission for others who privately held similar views to speak more openly. Within 2 weeks of Harrison's initial interview, approximately 35 Republican members of Congress had made public statements expressing some degree of concern about Trump's legal situation and its implications for the party's constitutional credibility. The substantive concerns being articulated by these lawmakers fall into several distinct categories that reflect different dimensions of constitutional liability. The first category involves questions about executive power and the limits of presidential authority. Multiple legal proceedings have raised allegations that Trump used executive authority for personal political benefit rather than legitimate governmental purposes, including claims that he attempted to pressure state officials to alter election results, that he mishandled classified documents in ways that violated statutory requirements, and that he interfered with congressional oversight by refusing to comply with lawfully issued subpoenas. Republicans who have spent decades advocating for constitutional limits on executive overreach find themselves in the awkward position of defending actions that appear to exceed those limits, creating internal contradictions that constituents and political opponents have begun highlighting. The second category involves respect for judicial authority and the rule of law. Federal courts have issued numerous orders requiring Trump to produce documents, provide testimony, or comply with other legal obligations. In several instances, Trump's legal team has exhausted all available appeals and lost on the merits, yet compliance has still been resisted through various delay tactics and public attacks on the legitimacy of the courts involved. For Republicans who have historically emphasized respect for judicial decisions and the importance of law and order, defending continued resistance to final court orders creates a significant credibility problem. Voters who value stability and respect for institutions notice the contradiction between stated principles and actual positions on specific cases. The third category concerns congressional oversight and the separation of powers. The Constitution grants Congress broad authority to conduct investigations and demand documents and testimony as part of its legislative and oversight functions. Republicans have historically defended these congressional prerogatives when their party controlled committees investigating Democratic administrations. However, defending Trump's refusal to comply with congressional subpoenas requires arguing for much more limited congressional authority, creating an inconsistency that Democrats have exploited effectively in political messaging. The bipartisan nature of some recent subpoenas, where both Republican and Democratic committee leaders have signed identical demands, makes the political defense even more difficult because it cannot be dismissed as purely partisan overreach. The fourth category involves basic honesty and accountability in public life. Multiple legal proceedings have presented evidence that Trump made false statements to banks, insurance companies, tax authorities, and government investigators. Defending these actions requires Republicans to argue either that the evidence is fabricated, which becomes increasingly implausible as courts review and credit the evidence, or that such conduct should not be considered disqualifying for political leadership. Many Republicans find neither position acceptable, particularly when they have spent years emphasizing the importance of personal character and ethical behavior in public office. These substantive concerns have merged with practical political calculations about electoral viability and party positioning for future elections. Polling data from multiple sources shows that independent voters and moderate Republicans have become increasingly uncomfortable with Trump's legal situation and the party's defense of his actions. In suburban districts that will be crucial for maintaining or expanding Republican congressional majorities, candidates are finding that association with Trump's legal controversies creates significant headwinds. Focus groups conducted by Republican consulting firms have consistently shown that persuadable voters react negatively to arguments that appear to place Trump above legal accountability, viewing such positions as inconsistent with the rule of law, principles that many voters consider fundamental to American democracy. The electoral implications became particularly clear during several special elections and local races in late January and early February, where Republican candidates who closely aligned themselves with Trump's legal defense messaging underperformed relative to expectations, while Republicans who maintained some distance from those specific issues performed better. Republican strategists have begun circulating internal memos arguing that the party needs to develop positions on Trump's legal situations that allow candidates to support his policy agenda and acknowledge his political accomplishments, while not requiring them to defend specific actions that courts and prosecutors have identified as potentially criminal. This nuanced position is exactly what senior Republicans like Harrison, Matthews, and Chen have begun articulating publicly. The shift in party positioning has generated intense backlash from Trump's most loyal supporters, who view any public criticism or expression of concern as betrayal and evidence of establishment Republican weakness. Social media platforms favored by Trump supporters have featured extensive attacks on the senators and representatives who have questioned the wisdom of defending all aspects of Trump's legal positions. Primary challenges have been threatened against several of the lawmakers who spoke most directly about constitutional liabilities. Trump himself has issued statements attacking Republicans who have expressed concerns, characterizing them as weak and disloyal. However, the lawmakers who have begun speaking publicly about these concerns appear to have calculated that the political risks of continued unconditional defense outweigh the risks of incurring Trump's displeasure. This calculation reflects several factors. First, polling suggests that Trump's hold on Republican primary voters, while still substantial, has weakened somewhat as legal challenges have accumulated and as other potential candidates have emerged. Second, general election considerations have become more pressing as Republicans contemplate maintaining congressional majorities in competitive districts where Trump's legal situation creates vulnerabilities. Third, there is a growing sense among institutional Republicans that the party needs to develop an identity and governing agenda that extends beyond Trump's personal interests and legal battles. The constitutional liability framing that Republicans are increasingly adopting serves several strategic purposes. It allows them to acknowledge legitimate concerns about Trump's legal situation without completely repudiating his presidency or policy agenda. It frames the issue in terms of constitutional principles that Republicans have traditionally emphasized, making the criticism appear consistent with rather than contradictory to party values. It creates space for Republicans to support legal processes and judicial authority without requiring them to make definitive judgments about Trump's guilt or innocence before legal proceedings have concluded. And it signals to moderate voters that the party retains some commitment to constitutional norms and legal accountability despite its close association with Trump over the past several years. The emerging Republican position appears to be converging around several key points that attempt to balance competing considerations. First, Trump's policy accomplishments during his presidency should be recognized and defended, including appointments of conservative judges, tax reform, deregulation, and various foreign policy initiatives. Second, current legal proceedings should be allowed to proceed without political interference, and the outcomes should be determined by courts and juries rather than being predetermined by partisan considerations. Third, Republicans should not be required to defend every specific action that courts have found violated legal obligations or that prosecutors have charged as criminal conduct. Fourth, the party needs to develop a forward-looking agenda that addresses current challenges rather than being consumed entirely by litigation over past actions. This position represents a significant evolution from the unified defense that Trump received from Republicans during his presidency and immediately afterward. It acknowledges that some of Trump's actions have created genuine constitutional and legal problems rather than dismissing all allegations as partisan persecution. It creates space for Republicans to criticize specific conduct without being accused of completely abandoning Trump or betraying party loyalty, and it attempts to reestablish some connection between Republican rhetoric about constitutional principles and the party's actual positions on specific controversies involving Trump. Whether this shift in Republican positioning will prove durable remains uncertain and will depend substantially on how Trump's various legal proceedings develop over the coming months. If courts continue to reject his legal arguments, and if criminal trials result in convictions on serious charges, the pressure on Republicans to maintain some distance will likely intensify. Conversely, if Trump succeeds in delaying proceedings or if juries acquit him on major charges, Republicans who expressed concerns may face criticism for having abandoned him prematurely. What is already clear is that the unanimous Republican defense that Trump could rely on during his presidency and immediately afterward has fractured. Senior party leaders with significant influence and credibility have begun publicly characterizing his legal situation as a constitutional liability rather than a purely partisan witch hunt. This represents a meaningful shift in party dynamics that creates more political space for other Republicans to express similar concerns, and that changes the calculations for candidates deciding how closely to align themselves with Trump heading into future elections. The question facing Republicans is no longer whether Trump's legal challenges create any political problems for the party. That much has been conceded by the senators and representatives who have begun speaking about constitutional liabilities. The question now is how the party navigates between maintaining connection with Trump's political base while also addressing the concerns of moderate voters who value constitutional norms and legal accountability. The lawmakers who are reframing their positions appear to believe that a more nuanced stance that acknowledges problems while not completely repudiating Trump offers the best path forward. Whether that calculation proves correct will significantly influence Republican electoral prospects and the party's institutional identity in the years ahead.